Brush textures are a powerful feature that allow us to incorporate the detail of an image file to stamp the surface of our sculpture. So let's take a closer look. First, we need to create a texture in the texture menu with that new button. And I recommend naming this to something that we'll recognize, like brush underscore text. The reason being that whenever we create this, it's actually a blank texture slot. And if I stroke on the surface, nothing happens. We need to modify the texture in the texture settings with the red checker icon. Here you can see it's the one we named, brush text. It is an image type texture by default, but you have access to a number of procedurals that also function with brush textures. We'll stick to the image texture for now. And this is where we can open an image file. Now I have a few examples loaded. We'll start with this rough block wall. And if I stroke on the surface now, you'll see that we get that texture being projected onto the surface. Now this is powerful because sculpting this detail by hand would take forever, but brush textures allow us to lay down this pattern very quickly. Now the way that this works is darker values of the texture, so closer to black, will have no effect on the brush, whereas white values will have full effect. So if we look at the image thumbnail, you can see that the cracks in the wall are darker color and the peaks of the stone are a brighter color. And so that's how we get the depth information. And this texture is a displacement texture from texturehaven.com because displacement works the exact same way. So they make ideal brush textures. Now the way that this is being projected onto the surface is controlled with the mapping setting. By default, it's set to tiled, and to see what that means, I'm going to enable the texture alpha display. Well, specifically, if I increase the texture alpha, now you can definitely see that the texture is being tiled all the way across the 3D view. And since the texture is a tileable texture, it works out fine. Procedurals also tile fine as well. But something to keep in mind is this is being projected from the 3D view specifically. So if I stroke on the front of the object, it works great. But if I start to stroke towards the outer edge, it will look like it's fine from this angle. But when I rotate around the model, you can see that it's being stretched, just like projecting a video projector onto a curved surface. The next type of mapping we'll look at is view plane. And this is the same in the sense of the angle, in that the texture is limited to the direction that we're looking at the model. So you can see that the blue icon of the brush orients itself according to the surface, but the texture stays facing us. And so we will have the same issue on the edge where it stretches. So I say all this, that anything to do with the view plane, that's the limitation. However, the function of the brush, let's turn off the texture alpha. The way that the view plane mapping works is it takes your texture and duplicates it along the stroke according to your stroke spacing. So at 10, it's kind of like Morse code, dit, 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 dit. And at a spacing of 10, they're very close together. But if I increase the spacing to 50, you'll see that the pattern is spaced a little more broadly. And very similar to this, we have area plane. But this solves the projection along the edge in that it orients the texture according to the surface normal. So as I stroke along the outside edge, we don't get that stretching. And more often I find this useful as opposed to view plane. Also related to this, we have the random option, which does the same thing as view plane and area plane, except it randomly adjusts the angle of the texture. So if we turn that back down to 10% spacing, you should be able to see how it's orienting the texture in a random angle. We also have tiled mapping, which you've already seen. 3D mapping, I haven't found a lot of use for this because it limits the projection to top and bottom. So you can see it kind of scales the texture up to fit your object and then projects that texture through your object. So we get a lot of stretching on the sides, but on the top and bottom, it's fine. I do find it odd though that you cannot adjust the angle. You can adjust the offset location-wise and you can adjust the size, but not the angle. So the only practical use I've experienced for this is sculpting a terrain. So with this plane, for example, let's go to sculpt mode and I will load another texture, this terrain texture. And here, as I sculpt on the flat plane, all the mountains and valleys go up in the z-axis as I would want. And so that can be useful. But besides that, I don't find a lot of use for the 3D mapping type. And then I believe there's one more. Yes, stencil. So this does come in handy quite often. As we click the stencil mapping, you can see that we get an overlay of the texture that we can move around in the 3D view. And if I put it on an empty space and shrink the size of my brush, we can specifically paint the detail that we see in the stencil. And this comes in very handy for specific details in specific locations. Now, in order to move this thing around, you right-click and drag to move it, shift right-click and drag to increase or decrease the size, and then control right-click and drag to rotate the stencil. And the last type of brush texture application I want to show you in this video is the anchored stroke method. So first, let's change the mapping to area plane and the stroke to anchored. What this is useful for is clicking and dragging the whole of our brush texture in one intuitive motion. I use this a lot for skin pores or certain details like a screw head. So I have a texture here that is a screw head. And when we click and drag, you can see that we can add a screw very intuitively. Now, it is very soft around the edges, and that's due to our fall off. So I'm going to change this to a custom fall off, remove one of the points, and then drag it all the way to the corner. This way, we have the full effect of our texture, and then it quickly falls off around the edges. And now if I click and drag, you can see that screw. And so the bigger we make the screw, the less pixelated it looks. This brings up a good point that in order to achieve the level of detail we see in the images, we need a lot of polygons in our mesh. And in this case, you can see the pixelation of mesh resolution. And often whenever you're sculpting with brush textures, you need a really high polygon count. And so that is an overview of brush textures. Again, a very powerful feature worth knowing about.